Welcome to the game. Like and subscribe to stay in the loop with all our content. Pawn to e4 is the best move.
Pawn to d5 is the best move.
This is a book move. The opening is called Indian Defense, normal variation.
Pawn to e6 is the best move.
Developing the knight to a strong central square, supporting the pawn on d4 and preparing to control the pawn to d5 square, while also eyeing the pawn to b4 square to potentially pin the bishop on c4.
This is a book move. The opening is called Nimzo-Indian Defense.
Control of the center with f3, preparing to develop other pieces and supporting the pawn structure. This move also slightly weakens the king's side, but is a common opening choice in the Nimzo-Indian Defense.
This is a book move. The opening is called Nimzo-Indian Defense, normal variation.
Preparing to develop the bishop and putting pressure on the king's side, while also eyeing the pawn to d5 pawn and potentially creating a pin on the pawn to c4 pawn.
Pawn to d5.
Knight to f3 is the best move.
I played pawn captures on c4 to challenge black's control of the center and create space for my pieces to develop. The pin on black's knight on pawn to c6 also makes it difficult for them to defend their pawn structure.
Attacking the pawn on pawn to c5 with bishop captures on c4 creates a strong initiative, putting pressure on black's position. The bishop on pawn to c4 also pins the knight on c6, limiting black's mobility.
Pawn to c5 is the best move.
Pawn to a3.
I played bxe3 plus to attack black's knight on c6, creating a pin in the c file and forcing black to respond to the check. This move also opens up the b file for my rook to potentially use later.
Pawn captures on c3 is best.
Queen to c7 is a strong move, attacking the bishop on pawn to c4 and preparing to develop the queenside pieces. It also puts pressure on the black position, forcing them to respond to the potential threat.
Bishop to e2 is a solid choice, supporting the central pawn and preparing to develop the rest of the pieces. It also slightly weakens the king's side, but this is mitigated by the bishop's potential to pin the knight on b6.
Preparing to develop the queenside pawns and potentially create a pass pawn on the queenside, while also supporting the pawn to d5 pawn and preparing to develop the dark square bishop.
Castling kingside to connect rooks, safeguard the king, and prepare for potential pawn breaks on the queenside. This move also helps to neutralize black's potential bishop on c8, allowing for more flexibility in the middle game.
I played bishop to b7 to attack white's bishop on c4, preparing to develop the rest of my pieces and control the center. This move also pins white's bishop, making it difficult for them to play pawn to d4 again.
Bishop to b2 is excellent. This defends a rook and pawn on a1 and c3. This develops a bishop. This fianchettos the bishop by putting it on a powerful diagonal. Pawn to c4 is best.
Developing the knight to a strong central square, supporting the pawn to d5 pawn and preparing to control the pawn to d4 square, while also eyeing the pawn to b4 square for potential development of the bishop.
Pawn captures on c5 is the best move.
Preparing to develop the queenside pawns and potentially create a pass pawn on the queenside, while also supporting the central pawns and preparing to develop the rest of the pieces.
Rook to c1 is a prophylactic move to prevent black's potential counterplay on the queenside, specifically a fifth push, which could have led to a weakness on c5. By controlling the c file, white maintains flexibility for future pawn breaks and prepares to develop the rest of the pieces.
Pawn to h6 is excellent. Rook from file to c8 is best. This defends a queen on c7. This develops a rook.
Rook to e1 is the best move.
I played pawn captures on d4 to challenge black's control of the pawn to d5 square and create space for my pieces to develop. This move also pins black's knight on d5, making it harder for them to attack my position.
Pawn captures on d4.
Attacking the bishop on pawn to c4 with race-out, creating a potential pin on the bishop, while also supporting the pawn on pawn to d5 and preparing to develop the rest of the pieces.
Bishop to d3.
Queen to f4.
Rook from file f to e1 is the best move.
Knight to f5 is the best move.
Knight to d2 is best.
Developing the knight to a strong central square, supporting the pawn to d5 pawn and preparing to control the pawn to d4 square, while also eyeing the pawn to b4 square for potential development of the bishop.
Developing the knight to a strong central square, preparing to control the pawn to d5 square and potentially attacking black's pawn on d5, while also supporting the bishop on c4.
Knight to f5.
Knight to d2. The game is over. It ended in a draw.